For years, the world has been told the same story about China's electric vehicle industry. A story about innovation, about efficiency, about how Chinese companies simply worked harder, moved faster. It looked believable. Chinese EV brands exploded almost overnight. Showrooms filled with futuristic cars. Massive factories appeared across the country. Prices became so cheap that even Western automakers started to panic. Suddenly, people everywhere began saying the same thing. China had won the EV race. But there's a part of this story that rarely gets discussed outside of financial reports and government documents. Because China's EV boom did not rise from a normal free market. It was built with enormous state support, carefully engineered over more than a decade by the Chinese government itself. And once you start looking behind the curtain, the entire industry begins to look very different. Back in the early 2000s, China understood something important. Traditional gasoline cars were already dominated by countries like Germany, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Companies like Toyota, Ford, Volkswagen, and BMW had decades of experience, global reputations, and technological advantages that China simply could not catch up to quickly. Competing head-to-head in traditional cars would have taken generations. So China looked at electric vehicles almost like a shortcut, a reset button. Instead of trying to defeat the old automotive giants in a game they had already mastered, China decided to bet on an entirely new industry before the rest of the world fully took it seriously. And this is where the state stepped in. The Chinese government didn't just support EVs casually. It practically built the entire ecosystem from the ground up. Consumers were offered huge subsidies just to buy electric cars. In some cities, buyers could receive thousands of dollars in incentives. Taxes were reduced or removed. Registration privileges were given to EV owners, while gasoline car owners faced restrictions. In crowded cities where getting a license plate for a normal car could take months or even years, EV buyers suddenly got special treatment. The message was obvious. China wanted people inside the country to buy electric cars no matter what. But the support didn't stop with consumers. Local governments across China became obsessed with attracting EV companies into their regions. City officials wanted factories because factories meant jobs, investment, headlines, and political prestige. Entire provinces started competing with each other to become the next EV capital of China. Companies were offered cheap land, extremely low-interest loans, preferential electricity prices, infrastructure support, sometimes even direct financial assistance. In many cases, starting an EV company in China began to look less like building a business and more like entering a national strategic program. And suddenly, EV startups began appearing everywhere. Some had serious technology, some barely had functioning prototypes. But money continued flowing into the sector because everyone understood one thing. The government wanted this industry to grow at all costs. To the outside world, it looked like a massive wave of entrepreneurship. But behind the scenes, the state was quietly shaping the battlefield itself. And honestly, that changes how we should view China's so-called EV miracle. Because in a true free market, companies survive by proving they can compete naturally. They fail if consumers reject them. They collapse if their business model doesn't work. The market decides who wins and who loses. But in China's EV industry, the government often acted almost like a referee who was also playing in the game. It chose strategic industries. It directed investment. It protected certain companies. It encouraged banks to lend aggressively, and it created an environment where growth became the highest priority, even if profitability came later. Or never. That's why the industry expanded at a speed that shocked the world. Factories were built unbelievably fast. Supply chains scaled at terrifying speed. Battery production exploded. Entire cities transformed into manufacturing hubs almost overnight. Western executives watched this happen in disbelief. Meanwhile, Chinese EV brands kept getting bigger, faster, and cheaper. And eventually, the world began calling it innovation. But innovation alone doesn't usually create an industrial revolution this quickly, especially not one this expensive. Because underneath the headlines, someone had to absorb the risk, someone had to finance the losses, someone had to keep the machine running, even when many companies were still burning enormous amounts of cash. And in China's case, that someone was often the state itself. This is the part many people misunderstand about China's economic model. The government doesn't always need companies to become immediately profitable. Sometimes the goal is much larger than short-term business success. Sometimes the goal is dominance, market control, supply chain power, global influence. And if achieving that requires years of heavy subsidies and aggressive state backing, Beijing appears perfectly willing to do it. That strategy helped China become the world's largest EV producer. But it also created a strange contradiction inside the industry itself. Because when growth is fueled this heavily by government support, it becomes difficult to tell where genuine market success ends and where artificial momentum begins. And that question would eventually become one of the biggest concerns surrounding China's entire EV empire. From the outside, China's EV industry looks almost unstoppable. Sales numbers keep rising. New brands keep appearing. Massive auto shows fill entire convention centers with futuristic electric cars covered in giant LED screens and dramatic music. Chinese companies are exporting vehicles around the world at prices many Western automakers struggle to match. And every few months, headlines appear claiming China is dominating the future of transportation. To most people watching from the outside, it creates a very simple impression. These companies must be making enormous amounts of money. But that assumption hides one of the biggest contradictions inside China's EV boom. Because many Chinese EV companies are not truly healthy businesses. In fact, a surprising number of them are still losing money, and some are losing astonishing amounts of it. This is where the story becomes very different from the image being presented to the world. Because high sales do not automatically mean a company is financially strong. Selling millions of cars sounds impressive, but if the profit margin on each car is tiny, or even negative, then growth itself can quietly become dangerous. And that is exactly what has been happening inside large parts of China's EV industry. Many companies became obsessed with one thing above all else: expansion. Not profit, not sustainability, growth. The logic was simple: grow fast enough, dominate the market early, and figure out profitability later. Investors loved this strategy because it created explosive headlines and rising valuations. Local governments supported it because rapid growth made China appear technologically unstoppable. Consumers benefited because prices became unbelievably cheap. But somebody always pays for cheap prices eventually. And in this case, many EV companies started paying with their own balance sheets. To attract buyers, companies kept cutting prices aggressively. Then competitors responded by lowering prices even further. Suddenly, the industry became trapped in a brutal race where everyone was trying to undercut everyone else. A company lowers prices to gain market share. Competitors panic and slash prices too. Then margins shrink across the entire industry. And once that cycle starts, escaping it becomes extremely difficult. This is why China's EV market slowly transformed into something that resembles economic cannibalism. Companies are not simply competing anymore, they are consuming each other. Every price cut creates more pressure. Every discount pushes weaker companies closer to collapse. Some brands sell vehicles so cheaply that analysts openly question whether they are making meaningful profits at all. In some cases, companies appear more focused on surviving another quarter than building a sustainable business for the next decade. And yet, strangely, the industry keeps expanding. That's because many of these companies are not surviving purely through profits from selling cars. Instead, they continue operating through outside financing. Investor money, government-backed loans, state-linked banks, continuous fundraising. In some cases, companies burn massive amounts of cash year after year, while still being treated like future champions. In a normal market, businesses that consistently lose money eventually run out of oxygen. But China's EV sector often operates under different rules. As long as growth continues, funding often continues too. And this creates a dangerous illusion. From the outside, the industry appears gigantic and unstoppable. But internally, many companies are under enormous financial stress. Some are carrying heavy debt loads. Others rely on constant fundraising just to maintain operations. And many are trapped inside a market where competition has become so extreme that profitability keeps getting pushed further into the future. It's almost like building a skyscraper taller and taller, while quietly weakening the foundation underneath it. What makes this even more unstable is the speed at which China's EV market evolved. Too many companies entered the industry at once. Too many factories were built too quickly. Too much production capacity flooded the market. And now dozens of companies are fighting over the same customers in a war where lowering prices feels like the only weapon left. The result is an industry that looks incredibly powerful on the surface, while internally, many companies are bleeding cash. And this is the uncomfortable truth hidden behind China's EV miracle. Growth alone does not guarantee stability. A company can dominate headlines while struggling financially behind closed doors. It can sell record numbers of vehicles while barely making money from them. It can look like the future of the global auto industry while surviving largely on loans, investor confidence, and the hope that profitability will somehow arrive later. And eventually, an important question starts to emerge. If an industry needs endless expansion just to survive, what happens when the growth finally slows down?